You may have heard me say already that if I hadn't believed in God because of other experiences and because of what I was taught, as a Hebrew Bible teacher and student, I would have been pushed to believe in God because Yehud, the Jews, survived. And really, if you think about what they were up against in the Persian period, it's hard to explain. That they not only survived, they thrived. Christians tend to hear a lot about how desolate and how longing for a Messiah and how empty things are until Jesus comes. We get that in our Advent hymns. It wasn't that way. Let me show you what actually happened as I read it. Again, I'm drawing on Renee Albrecht's Joseph Blenkinsop and Rich Weiss, a very great deal. Let's look at it. It was truly a struggle for identity and survival. And that in very many ways. The numbers, the population of both Jerusalem and the environs that comprised Judah were very low. There was a lot of economic and political tensions between Jerusalem and the northern Samaritans, and between the Golah, those who had been exiled. Gala means to exile, so Golah, and those who had never gone. There's a lot of struggle. There is a great deal of fragmentation as people try to adjust to the situation of colonization and to the tensions. There's very different ways in which people responded, and we'll see that. And there's different camps, and we'll see that in a moment. Moreover, they lost the defining institutions. I'll talk about that in a moment. And there were all kinds of pressures to assimilate to the huge, huge empire that was Persia. In terms of low numbers, we've already said Jerusalem had under 1,000. Early Persian Yehud, again drawing on Charles Carter's excellent dissertation, early Persian period Yehud had about 11,000 people in it. Later, between 17 and 18,000. And by the time the Romans are there, in 60 to 70 BCE, it's more like 100,000. So, woo, what a lot of flourishing. The economic and political struggle, it's partly the payment of tribute. That's always, in an extraction economy, that's always such a struggle to pay the emperor the tribute he requires. But there's conflict between the Yehudites and the Idumeans, and there's conflict between the Samaritans and the Yehudites. And you'll hear more about that in the Newer Testament, but it already exists. You may remember, according to 1 Kings 12, after Rehoboam, Solomon's son, says, no, I'm not going to ease the burden of taxation and of conscription on you. I'm going to be tougher than my father. And the northern tribes leader, Jeroboam the first, shouts, "To your tents, O Israel, what part have we in the house of David?" Well, in Ezra and Nehemiah, we read that the Samaritans want to come down and help rebuild the temple, and the Judahites won't let them have a share. They say, "What part have you in the house of David?" Now, I don't know how much that is literary style and how much it was actually true, but there is a great deal of tension. You see, Samaria had been the center for everything west of the Jordan River, and it wanted to stay the center. That was politically advantageous to it and economically advantageous. It did not want Jerusalem to be a counter center, to be a rival. Moreover, The Edomians would have sort of wanted a piece of the pie, but they didn't get it. It's also fragmented. It's fragmented because the Golah who come back want the land that was their fathers or their grandfathers back. But the ones who stayed have been there for a generation too, and they're not about to give it up without a struggle. I hate to say it, but the Golah, who have been the elite forever, they won that power struggle. There's different questions about who owns the land, but also who fills the roles. There's a lot of power struggle among the priests at this point. In Deuteronomy, you may recall, any Levite is a priest. By the Persian period, only Aaronites, those who trace their descent from Aaron, Moses' brother, this is all fictive, of course, or at least it's partly fictive, but this specific group, they won the battle, and the Levites became temple servants who served the Aaronites. Now, there was a group in exile called the Zadokites, who were a subgroup of the Aaronites who thought that only the Zadokites should be able to offer sacrifice. And that's the kind of what you see in the book of Ezekiel, but they didn't win. So it's somewhere in the middle. There's also a lot of religious ideas that are different. Circumcision became much, much more important in exile. A role of women was higher in exile and in Egypt. And so there's tensions. In fact, people of the land complain, you can read about it in Nehemiah 5, that they are being oppressed to the point that they have already had to sell some of their daughters into slavery. So it's a very real conflict, and we see that kind of conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians today. We saw it just a few decades ago between the Samozans and the Sandinistans. It's been a conflict in Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania between the descendants of the Russians and the original citizens, because both had fair claims to the same land, and so it was in the Persian period in Yehud. As I said, the role of women was better in exile and in Egypt. And in fact, about this time, we start seeing a lot more Yahwistic names of women, and we start seeing women's seals. It starts a little earlier than this, but Jewish women start having seals of their own, which means they must have had businesses. I suspect that Proverbs 31, the woman of valor who can find, who is, by the way, a very economically elite woman, I suspect that that was compiled in this period or later, because the role of women seems to be somewhat stronger. It's partly class, since the Gola were elite, and the people of the land included only a few elite and mostly peasants. And we don't know as much as I would like to about the elite. We know what the Assyrian laborers look like compared to the Assyrian upper class. We know what the Egyptian lower class look like compared to the upper class. But in Israel and Judah, in all of the West Semitic lands like Syria, we only have wall paintings and statuettes of the upper class. So we don't know very much about the lower classes. But we know that the people of the land were peasants and that they struggled. Even among the elite, however, there was a great deal of diversity. In terms of the aristocrats, they're the lay, and they're the prophets, and there are the priests. And each of those groups have subdivisions. The prophets, there's different groups. Nehemiah in the 5th century will lead one group, and Noadiah, a female, a woman, a prophet, leads the other group. And because Nehemiah has the power of Persia behind him, he's a Persian appointee, his group won. But it's interesting to know that a woman could be the head of a group of prophets. The priests, as I said, were having a real power struggle. It's just barely under the surface in the book of Numbers. I was immersed in numbers for some 13 years, and I cannot stress strongly enough how clear it is that there were power struggles. By the way, this is a Syrian priest from the time of the Iron Two, um, when Israel would have existed. It's a wall painting, and of course the clothing is different, but the skin color, the beard, the hair color, that would have been the same for the Judahites as for Syria. So this is as close as we're going to get to a Judahite priest. Just imagine they have a different kind of head covering and robe. The Aaronites were in struggles with the Levites, and both of them were in struggles with the Zadokites and the Aaronites one. And then there were lay. There were lay elders who were appointed by age and wisdom in their villages, and some would be urban and some would be rural. And there were aristocrats who were not priests and who were leaders by virtue of class. And some would be lay male and some would be female, and there's a lot of fragmentation. And they come out with all different positions. You have priestly reformers, you have priestly who fight the reform, you have Deuteromistic circles that look at things a little bit differently than the priests do. And the priests are not, as I said, homogenous, but even the Aaronites aren't homogenous, because there are priests behind Ezra who wants nothing to do with the Samaritans or with any non-Judahite, and only those Jews who can trace their lineage back to a citizen of Judah is allowed in, versus the rest of the priests who compiled Leviticus and then Numbers. Numbers insists that every single tribe of Israel has an equal portion in the sacred site. So it's an inclusive view. There's wisdom circles. They're the ones behind Job and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus, Sirach, the like. There are those who put all their hope in eschatological leaders. The prophet who will come, the Messiah who will come. Messiah just means anointed one. And so they hoped for an anointed prophet or an anointed king who would get them out of their troubles. There are those who advocate for clear boundaries, like Ezra and Nehemiah, and those who are universalists. The priests go a little bit that way, and the anonymous prophet of exile, 2nd Isaiah, and his successors who compiled 3rd Isaiah, Trito Isaiah, 56 through 66, they have a very big strand of universalism. There are those who advocate for traditional family structures and those who advocate for a higher status of women. And you do get some laws changing right about now. The law that has to do with establishing the law of levirate marriage, Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. In the Hebrew, it insists that it must be a male child who establishes the name. But in the Greek translation, it's any child. So a daughter could establish the name. And in Numbers 27, which is a Persian period piece, in the absence of sons, a daughter could inherit the land. So there are some laws that open things up a bit. I talked about the loss of defining institutions. You will remember, Judah knew it was Judah because they were the people who worshipped at the Jerusalemite temple, the center for sacrificial worship, and they were the ones ruled by the king. Well, Babylon burnt the temple to the ground and ended the Davidic kingship. And of course, the identity was centered in the geography. The land they believed had been promised them to their ancestors, the land which was the context of covenant, the land that was theirs by God's gift. Edomites took half the land, and the Jews were scattered to Egypt, Judah, and Babylon. Never again will there be a territorial definition of who is a true Judahite. So that's a lot of loss of identity. And there is enormous pressure to assimilate. The Edomites assimilated. The Assyrians assimilated, though there is a movement to reclaim being Assyrian. It's a huge empire. In the early 6th century,
I missed that. Could you say?
sorry, it's a huge empire. It goes all the way from what is now Turkey, Asia Minor, all the way to the edge of India, and later it will include all of Egypt. There's a huge pressure to assimilate, and yet they did not. Instead, they established a redefinition of themselves. And they create the loss of institutional identity created space for new ideas and new leadership. And the fragmentation became a very creative pluralism. I don't have a purple one for the economic and political struggle that continued. The pluralism is reflected in our canon. There's great diversity within the canon that stems from the diversity of positions now. There's the priestly writings in the Pentateuch from this period. The prophetic books that were began to be compiled before the exile were redacted during the Persian period, and there were new prophets. Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, they began before the exile, but they were finished during the Persian period. The Chronicles and Ezra Nehemiah are products of the Persian period. Ruth and Jonah are almost certainly products of the Persian period. And the final form of the Psalter was compiled during the Persian period. So Persian period Yehud is the time when the foundations that were later normative for Judaism and Christianity were strongly, solidly laid. It is a time that set the direction for canonization. The Pentateuch is established during the Persian period. We know that because the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Jewish Pentateuch are so similar, and yet by the end of the Persian period, the Samaritans and the Jews had nothing to do with each other. So it had to be established before then. And it was during this time that eschatology, which is the end times kind of hopes and beliefs, which led to apocalyptic, which led to the New Testament's basic intellectual framework, that was developed in the Persian period. And it is in the Persian period that the temple and Torah become absolutely central. And later, that synagogues start to be developed, probably, although it may be that it was during the Hellenistic period before you actually get buildings that are synagogues. Certainly there were communities of Jews gathering for worship and study during the Persian period. It is difficult to express just how fundamental Yehud and the Judahites in diaspora at this period were for later Judaism and Christianity. This is the end of my final PowerPoint for this semester. And please email me or post any questions you may have. Thank you.